How are you doing?
Doing well, doing well. Thank you so much, everyone, just for your patience as we were setting up on the back end. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Please make sure that your microphones are on mute for the time being. We're going to get started, and then I'll introduce our speaker for this evening, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. All right, so good evening and welcome as the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation with the City of Houston Chief Sustainability Officer, Lara Cottingham. Hi, I'm Felicia Chapman, the Senior International Education Manager of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. And together with the Council's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Conversations with a Conscience. Our program this evening is part of our monthly series for Student World Affairs Council and WAC members to engage in dialogue around world issues with community leaders and hear from one another about ways to get involved. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to also mention some of our upcoming programs. This Thursday, we will host Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, Admiral James Stavridis. This Friday, our lunch program, Global Connections, our guest will be Ryan Gorziski of Gulf Coast Council of Return Peace Corps Volunteers. And this Saturday, we will have our Global Perspective Summit, Global Education in the Digital Age. Speakers will be featured from Stanley Morgan, Asia Society of Texas, Time Magazine, University of Houston, Lone Star College, and so many more. We hope that you join us this Saturday for our Global Perspective Summit, which is a free summit. Any teachers who attend and participate will have the opportunity to earn up to 6 hours of professional development credit. And did I mention that it's free? So we hope that you'll join us. And for more information on these wonderful programs and so much more, please visit our website at wachhouston.org. Tonight, we are honored to have City of Houston's Chief Sustainability Officer, Lara Cottingham. With 13 years of communication and public policy experience, Lara Cottingham is the Chief of Staff of the Administration and Regulatory Affairs Department and the Chief Sustainability Officer for the City of Houston. In addition to leading the Mayor's Sustainability Office, Lara is the public figure face of ARA in the media as well as before City Council, industry stakeholders, and customers. Prior to joining the City of Houston, Lara was a member of Hill+Knowlton Strategies Houston office, providing strategic counsel and sustainability and social responsibility issues for a broad range of clients across the energy sector. Lara worked in Washington, D.C., and served as communications director for the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, vice chairman of the House Transportation Committee, and vice chairman of the Sustainability, Energy, and Environment Caucus, as well as for congressional campaigns in Colorado, West Virginia, and Texas. She also produced a web-based reality show for CNN and served as government and marketing consultant for South by Southwest Interactive in Austin, Texas. So without further ado, World Affairs Council is please help me welcome Lara Cottingham. One moment. Hi, Lara, are you ready?
Okay. Hello. Sorry about that. Some technical difficulties on my end. Are you ready? Sorry, I missed whatever went on before now.
No, I just introduced you, and then everyone's ready and waiting to hear more about this climate action plan.
Okay.
And how we can get involved.
All right. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Mhm.
All right, can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. So hello, my name is Lara Cottingham. I am the City of Houston's Chief Sustainability Officer, and I'm really happy to talk to you guys about the Climate Action Plan today. I'll go through some slides about the background, but I would really love to just get questions from you all. So I will try to go through it fairly quickly. Just know that if you have any questions, ask me in the middle of the presentation. That's totally cool. And I will share all of the information that we have afterwards. And this is the presentation that I gave to Houston City Council on the Climate Action Plan. So it's also available online as well. And so the City of Houston's first ever Climate Action Plan was launched earlier this year, April 22nd. That's the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And if you had asked me, never in 1,000 years would I have thought that we would have released the Climate Action Plan in the middle of a global pandemic. But not only did we manage to release it given everything that's going on, but actually everything around climate seems to have moved forward faster during COVID. The pandemic has accelerated things. Some chronicle stories here showing that we've gotten overwhelmingly positive results, overwhelmingly positive support from the community about the Climate Action Plan. Earlier this year, we had a launch of the plan called Houston Climate Week. It was the first time we've ever done anything like this, and we had over 5,200 people register for a week long of climate events to talk about what the Climate Action Plan is, how people can get involved. It actually started in August and then had to be postponed thanks to not one but two hurricanes that were at one point coming to Houston, but it got moved to September. All of that information is also available if you're interested. Some background on cities and climate, right? Why are we talking about climate change at all? Why is the City of Houston talking about climate change? And this really goes.
Get it on there?
No, we can't.
Okay. I'm not
Oh, hello, sorry. This really goes back to the Paris Agreement, which has been a big topic lately with the presidential election. The day after the election was actually the day that the United States officially withdrew from the Paris Agreement, but the new incoming administration has committed to rejoining the Paris Agreement. Why does that matter? Because the Paris Agreement is a global national agreement that every country except for the United States, and I think Syria had committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to help fight climate change. So if you think about it, it was a blanket that covered the whole planet. When you take part of it out, you have a hole. And what happened was overnight in the United States, you saw cities stepping forward saying, we're still in, we still support the Paris Agreement, we're gonna do our part. Mayor Turner, who I work for, who is such an incredible voice on climate, who has been so strong and so bold and brave on climate that it means a lot for the mayor of Houston, the energy capital of the world, to come forward and say that we are not only believing in climate change, but we are committed to being part of the solution. So he's co-chair of a group called Climate Mayors, and we're organizing almost 500 mayors in the United States to come together and work on climate. And that is why we have a climate action plan, because the first thing you do is you say, we're going to work on climate. The second thing you have to do is figure out, what does that mean? What are we actually going to do? And it's not just Houston, right? It's global mega cities. Almost 70% of the world's population lives in cities right now. So cities are the front lines. We are the boots on the ground and the boats in the water. Cities have a really big role to play. But it's Houston. It's also, for the first time, Dallas and Austin and San Antonio and Houston, right? So Texas cities that are all involved in the energy industry are all coming forward and taking action on climate. another reason like why we are talking about climate change in Houston is that we are so incredibly impacted by climate change. For most of us, no matter how old you are or how long you've lived in Houston, you've been impacted by flooding in one way or another. The straw that broke the camel's back, the turning point for Houston was really Hurricane Harvey. And it wasn't just that it was the largest rainfall event in North America. It's that it was the third, what we call 500-year floods in 3 years that came to our city. And that since then we've had subsequent floods in 2018. We had Tropical Storm Imelda in 2019. When I first wrote this PowerPoint, we didn't know what was going to happen for 2020. We've had Hurricane Lara and Laura and Marco and Beta, and I think we're up to Theta now, right? So climate change means not only do we have more storms, we have stronger, slower, and more wet storms that speed up and they become large very quickly. All of these things are not only dangerous to cities, but they're really hard to plan and prepare for. And then another really interesting aspect that we're trying to do more from the city perspective is talk about climate and how it impacts heat. That here in Houston and in Texas, we think that it's hot here, totally used to that, when we can handle it. But what we don't necessarily think about all the time is that not only is it hotter today than it used to be, but it is predicted to be even hotter. And that this chart here shows that the average high temperature from the 70s to the 90s in Houston was 99 degrees. By 2050, that average high temperature could be 104 to 106 degrees. And by 2100, it could go all the way up to 109 degrees. Think about that. Think about what a Houston summer at 109 degrees would be like. Think about the number of days you have over 100. Think about there being almost a month or 2 months of days where it's over 100 degrees outside. Nights above 80 degrees. That doesn't sound quite so bad above 80 degrees, but the human body is actually, we're very resilient. We're built to withstand high temperature, but we have to cool down. And usually you cool down at night, and that's when you rest, and that's when your body repairs. So if you have nights above 80 degrees, you start having actual physical health conditions. And those conditions impact the elderly, they impact the very young, and anyone with pre-existing medical conditions, but also if you have, or you live in areas where there's air pollution. So vulnerable populations are going to be even more impacted. And that comes into a lot of the climate equity discussions that we're having. But it's going to affect everyone. Think about your electricity bills. Think about if everyone has to crank up their AC in the middle of the summer even more, that's going to put strain on our electric grid. And that's also going to make everybody's electricity prices probably go up as well. So there's a lot of reasons why we are facing climate already today, but we are expected to see even more changes. And these numbers in red and the difference here, it's so important because it shows temperature scenarios under low emissions and high emissions. It shows the potential of if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, if we try to meet these climate change goals, we really do have the potential to impact our future climate and the climate for the next generation. And so if we want to not see those red numbers, we need to all work together and do everything we can to look for ways to decarbonize our operations, to develop new technologies, and just become more efficient in our operations. Baseline emissions, this just really talks about other cities and compares them to Houston. If you see this chart right here, Houston's not the highest city in terms of per capita emissions, but we're just about the highest. And if you look at our community as a whole, we're probably the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And that's important. It shouldn't be really surprising because we have a lot of heavy industrial operations in our region, but it means that we have a lot of work to do. Our emissions come almost half and half from energy and from transportation. That is a little bit different than some cities. If you think about older cities in the Northeast that are more dense and that have more public transportation, they're maybe more walkable. Houston is very large or geographically spread out. When we grew up in the transportation era, in the highway era, and we're very car centric. So the flip side of that means there's a lot of opportunities to reduce emissions from our transportation sector. And the Climate Action Plan will talk about that more. Important thing to point out is the connection between sustainability and resilience. What does that mean? Because the city of Houston also has a resilience strategy. Oh, sorry. That when you think about it, it's really two sides of a coin. Sustainability or greenhouse gas mitigation is the long-term strategy to reduce fossil fuel and carbon emissions so that our climate in the future is not worse. Resilience talks about the immediate chronic stresses that we're facing today that are caused by climate change. So what are we doing to build a resilient city that is prepared to handle the flooding, the extreme heat, the challenges we're seeing right now, and is prepared to handle a future where things will be even more at risk due to climate. The Climate Action Plan itself is a science-based, community-driven strategy to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and meet that Paris Agreement goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. It has 12 goals, 12 targets, 36 strategies, and 96 actions. I will not read them for you. I highly recommend that you guys get the plan and look at it. If you have any questions, our office is always here to answer any kind of questions and also to help get you all involved. The plan really focuses on that emissions reduction, but the strategies and the actions that we're talking about have an incredible amount of community benefit. So even if you don't care about climate change, or you are really focused on transportation or on safety or on how it impacts me personally and my family, and the Climate Action Plan explains how these emission reduction goals and actions will improve our air quality. They will reduce energy costs, how they address environmental justice concerns and that climate equity, how they can create jobs and spur economic growth. And that is probably even more important now than when we started this process a couple of years ago, and that everything has happened to the energy industry and during the pandemic. Finding ways to green our economy can actually be incredibly beneficial to Houston. Creating the Climate Action Plan was a data and stakeholder driven process. What that means basically is that we didn't make this up. It is based on fact and is based on science. Houston is made up of a lot of very smart people, many of whom work for the energy industry or involved in the energy industry. And so we know that we have to really be on point when we talk about these things, that we have to be completely accountable and transparent, talking about what we know and what we don't know, what is achievable, what is not achievable, and because our community just knows more about this than others if you are in another part of the country that didn't have quite that energy focus. It's also really important here that you see that it's a cycle. But we created the Climate Action Plan. We started in 2019, and we took the whole year of community stakeholder development to put it together. So you imagine we were looking at it through that 2019 lens. I guarantee that it will change. We are in an iPhone 12, I think, world right now. It was only like a blink of an eye when we all had iPhone 6s. Think about what iPhone 20 will be like. Think about the changes that will happen. Now think about those changes in terms of the energy industry, in terms of cars, in terms of buildings. So much is going to happen. Technology and innovation is on our side. So we plan to regularly update the plan to take that technological change into account. And hopefully that's how we're going to meet our goals faster and easier. A little bit more about stakeholder engagement. We had over 30 meetings. We had over 500 one-on-one meetings. Like I said, our office is always here to talk with anyone who has questions. We had a pretty rigorous comment period because we wanted to make sure that the public knew about what we were doing and that they had the opportunity to comment, to learn more about it. We know in Houston that a plan isn't successful unless you have feedback from the community, that it could be that we could have just copied and pasted programs from other cities. But oftentimes if you take something that works really well in California or really well in New York and you bring it to Houston, it will not work at all because we are a very, very, very different city. And so we had working groups that were made up of leaders from the community, from neighborhood associations, from students, but also from multinational corporations and nonprofits. And we put them all in a room and we said, come up with strategies that work for Houston. That you guys live in Houston, you know what works and what doesn't. And they came up with what's recommended in the Climate Action Plan. This slide right here just talks about what we are trying to do. The top line shows us that if we do nothing, if we continue business as usual, those emissions are going to go higher and higher and higher. And if we reduce our emissions and try to get down here in that bottom right corner, and that's that Paris Agreement goal. It's important to note that we have interim targets. It's important to note that we have set these goals, but if we meet them faster, that's perfectly okay. And I can actually talk about some things that we had planned to do that we did that came about faster this year than ever expected. It's also, this slide shows how we think that we can see the most potential for emissions reduction from our transportation sector, from what we call energy transition or decarbonizing the kind of power that we use. Buildings are smaller but still important. Materials management or our waste cycle, smaller but still very important. That's something that every single one of us deals with every single day. And then the bottom is offsets. And that's really important because, again, talking about that, we're looking at it from a 2020 or a 2019 lens, that at this point in time, no one, not the International Energy Agency, not the UN, has a scenario where we can completely offset 100% of our emissions, or where we can completely replace 100% of our emissions, that we will still have to offset something. And that is okay, right? We don't have to know all of the answers right now. The point is we need to do as much as we can to start bending this curve. And as technology changes, we're going to be able to narrow that gap. We're going to learn more and more. We're going to come up with carbon capture technology. We're going to use nature-based solutions. We're going to plant a lot of trees. And that's how we're going to slowly be able to change the makeup of this grid. So the Climate Action Plan has 4 parts. Again, I'll kind of go over the 4 sections at a really high level. But for each section, there are goals and strategies and actions. For transportation, we talk a lot about electric vehicles and fleet electrification. That's really promising for Houston because we have so many cars, right? We love our cars. We have a parade every year where we decorate our cars and celebrate them. So moving to electric vehicles can help drastically reduce those emissions pretty quickly. But that's not the entire story. That we also need to have fewer cars. We need fewer miles traveled per person. The pandemic has made that happen, that each and every one of us on average is just driving and traveling so much less. So how do we maintain those benefits, but obviously have a thriving economy when we're allowed to go back to some sense of normal like we used to have? How do we encourage more public transportation? How do we build more bike lanes? And how do we have more sidewalks? How do we build communities so that you don't have to take a car or some sort of vehicle to get from place to place? And finally, and really most importantly, how do we make those transportation systems safe and equitable? Because if they're not safe, and if everyone can't access them, no matter what you do, they won't be successful. The energy transition section, this one is probably my favorite, and this one is very, very unique to Houston. We talk about a lot of things in here that other cities wouldn't talk about. We talk about how we increase our use of renewable and resilient energy in Houston. We have the highest potential, according to Google, for solar energy, but we have some of the lowest per capita installation. There's not a lot of rooftop solar in Houston. And so we're really looking at what can we do to change that. We're looking at how can we make Houston the leader in carbon capture and energy innovation. And this is, again, the really neat part about Houston is that if the companies that are based here all join us in our goals around reducing emissions, around leading this global energy transition, we have the potential to reduce emissions, not just here in Houston, but in every city where they operate, right? We have the potential to really impact the global energy sector. And that's really exciting. And I hope everyone can kind of learn to embrace that this kind of challenge is like the space race, which Houston also helped lead, right? So it's kind of in our blood. It's in our nature to tackle challenges like this. And in the 3 years that I've been working on this, there's been such a shift from the community in how we talk about this, how we embrace it, and people getting excited. We also look at using nature-based solutions that Houston has incredible natural resources. We have more park space than any other city in the country. We have an incredible opportunity to use our green space to help reduce flooding, to help reduce urban heat, but also to help act as natural carbon capture and storage. In terms of buildings, and this one is something that everyone has the potential to take part in. We're all in a building. Also, we all want to save money, right? If we use less electricity, your electricity bills will go down and you can put that money to something else. So to do that, we need to expand our investment in energy efficiency. There are some programs available, but not everybody knows about them. And they're probably not enough. And so we're looking for partners, we're looking at the state, we're looking at our utility partners to see what more can we do. And then investing in local jobs to help optimize our buildings, because you can build today very, very fancy, highly efficient buildings, but you need to have a pretty skilled workforce to maintain them. And if we don't start building that pipeline today, we won't have the workforce necessary to have a net zero fleet of buildings in Houston. And then finally, materials management. So this talks about the waste sector. This talks about how do we build a circular economy so we're not throwing things away as much. Right now, our landfills are they're not at capacity, but we think that within the next 20 years or so, they might reach capacity. What that means is that everything will become more expensive because new landfills are very expensive to build. They're usually a lot farther away. And that's just going to mean so many more truck trips back and forth to take waste to that new landfill. If we want to avoid those costs and reduce emissions, we need to come up with ways that we recycle more and we just divert more waste from going to the landfill in the first place. Can we look at optimizing our waste, maybe creating power from waste, right? That's a potential we've not really looked into, but that could help generate revenue and again, divert from the landfill. And ensuring long-term and safe disposal capacity. Harvey really showed us what can happen if you have a massive hurricane event and we don't ever want to be in that situation again. So with that, I'll just talk a little bit about the plan so far. Again, we released it in April. Since then, we have announced a partnership with BP to fund climate action implementation. Metro announced and opened the first BRT, bus rapid transit lane, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend it. Bus rapid transit are the train systems of the future, only they're not actually trains, they're buses. We launched a climate impact assessment. We have released a request for information to have a massive EV charging network all across the city. We most importantly have moved 100% of city buildings over to renewable energy. So as of July 1st, we are 100% renewable. The building that I'm in right now, City Hall, the Houston Zoo, all of the airports use solar and wind. We are the largest user of renewable energy in terms of cities in the country. We use more than any other city. That's really exciting. And if the city of Houston can do it, anybody else can. And we passed an ordinance officially adopting the climate action plan, officially creating the Office of Sustainability, and just saying that we are committing to establishing an open, inclusive public process for engaging the diversity that is in Houston to look at how we develop and implement and keep updating the climate action plan. So with that, I'll ask if you have any questions.
Hey, Lara, I had a few that were submitted through the chat, and so I'll just read off one of the first ones. Someone from the Japan American Society, they asked, how might the city of Houston's work with the Biden administration on climate change and a possible new Green Deal?
Okay, so the cities all work together. We work with the state government, we work with the federal government. In terms of climate, kind of everyone is waiting with bated breath to see what is in store. One of the things that we're working on, that we're working with climate mayors on, is this idea of, it's called a green and just recovery. And it's really just looking at, we know we're gonna have future stimulus packages, future recovery packages. Cities are hurting, right? Our tax base is down. It's cities that are putting up the testing centers for COVID. So what can we do to stimulate our local economy? And the energy transition can play a huge role in that. And so we're really working to make sure that anything that comes forward has incentives for clean transportation, for clean energy, for more solar and wind, for incentivizing industrial improvements to reduce those emissions. There's a lot of potential that cities can work with the federal government to do to not just bring support back to our communities and to our citizens that are all impacted by the pandemic, but do it in a way that we're also trying to tackle some of those climate goals.
Awesome. Karen asks, will any building code laws be changed to require sustainable architecture, motivation to build like other countries are doing, as shown in the Expo 2020 Dubai, to prevent flooding naturally?
Oh, that is such a good question. So trying to think of how to even begin. Because we are a city that is in a state, there are some things that cities have direct control over, and then there's some things that the state has control over, and there's some things the federal government has control over. Building code is one of the biggest things that the city of Houston can do in terms of changes to make our buildings more efficient, except in the state of Texas, there's a rule that says that cities can adopt a more aggressive building code than the state allows. The only exception for that is for things like flooding. And so ever since Harvey, the city has made several changes to where you can build with the floodplain. We're going to start looking at the areas that are not in the technical floodplain but continue to flood. And we're also looking at how to incentivize green storm water infrastructure so that future building incorporates physical design mechanisms that will help reduce flooding community-wide. We're also planning to bring forward in 21 the 2021 building code, which sounds pretty standard, but we tend to be a couple of years behind. And so we want to move to adopt the most aggressive building code with the most aggressive building efficiency standards as quickly as possible. And that over time will help us make sure all of our buildings are operating efficiently.
Thank you. Really quick before the next question, could you stop your screen share and then I'll just spotlight you so everyone can see you. Thank you. Awesome. Nancy, she said that she agrees that this is one of the biggest issues facing humanity today, but that she thinks part of the reason why it doesn't receive as much support as it should is because of the lack of solutions to people's concerns. These include maybe job losses, availability to resources they need in order to have a safer environment, the adaptability it would take for big corporations and the people all the way at the very bottom. how this would impact our economy and our livelihood through transition. So Nancy's question was, what would be some solutions that you would provide to people with these concerns, especially for the people at the bottom?
So that is so, that encapsulates the challenge, that the huge challenge that we're facing, that there's a very physical side, and it's almost easier to talk about that than the people side. And that there's a big communications breakdown. And I did not personally understand that until we started the climate action planning process. And I was at the meetings and I was talking with people, and I really learned what people know, what people don't know, what people think, what they aren't aware of, right? There's informational asymmetries all over the place. And I learned so much, because if we're not getting the information, if we're not sharing the information, it's never going to be successful. And so in terms of communicating why it's important, number one, if people don't see this as a priority, you're not going to see the action. But then number two, it's answering those questions and saying, how is this going to impact me? And that the questions tend to be, how is my personal safety going to be impacted, but also my livelihood, because that impacts the safety and health of my family that I'm taking care of. And so it means a little bit something different in Houston because we're so tied to the energy industry. But that's where the idea of the energy transition, and most importantly, Houston leading it, is really important. That we imagine the industry is going to change. That if we talk about decarbonizing, it means we're going to try and use as much renewable energy as possible. But the goal of the climate action plan and the goal of what we're talking about is not to move Houston away from the energy industry, right? We are a proud energy capital of the world. No one wants to give up that title. It's about moving the energy industry forward. It's about continuing our success. It's about expanding our success. It's about trying to address the environmental concerns that we're seeing at the same time as providing cleaner energy to our community, but also the world. And so if we do it right, we will be able to help existing companies, but also the folks kind of further down the chain, because everyone is impacted by that. I will say that the pandemic has brought a lot of the transition a lot faster than anyone thought, and that you want a nice orderly process over time, not almost overnight a complete halt in transportation on our planet. And so we are seeing layoffs, we're seeing very abrupt changes, but we're also seeing in Houston companies coming together and helping each other out, which is it is so inspiring to me, that there's this incredible energy innovation movement that's happening. You've got the ION with Rice that's coming in. You've got Greentown Labs that is the largest clean tech incubator. They call themselves Climate Tech in the country, and they just opened a new office in Houston because they realize that this is where this energy transition is happening. So there's a lot of new coming that will help push the traditional industry forward, but also help if anyone is worried, or if jobs over here need to shift over here. We're doing everything we can to make that pipeline so that they can stay connected as smoothly as possible.
Thank you. The next question from a member says, what collaboration are you doing with all Houston area school districts to scale education through ambassador programs like Half Earth Project and Roots and Shoots organization? Are you providing funding for interns as climate change prevention project managers in their schools? Can these kids write apps to track local issues like the weather.gov? And then teachers are overloaded and don't have the expertise that our youth do. So what schools are part of your stakeholder engagement?
Okay, lots to unpack there. So number one, the City of Houston does not, the HISD or the independent school districts are just that, they're independent. And so I don't have a really good way to connect with them. I actually can't send them information and say, hey, will you let all of your students know? I wish I could, because that would be so exciting. But if I could, then probably everyone could, and kids would be taking home like luggage size information every day, and nobody wants that. So we do, however, see the incredible potential that youth has in climate change, and that schools are an important conduit for not only getting information to them, but getting information from them. That I joke and I say that we need a small army in Houston to go out into the community and help us talk about these things. And I have seen groups of kids coming forward saying, we want to do that. We want to go out into the community. We want to talk about climate. We want to talk about why it's important to their generation, what it means to their communities. So we are doing a couple of things. One, we are right now working with a group of educators on developing climate action plan materials that the teachers can take and incorporate into their coursework. I know teachers are overwhelmed. There's a lot of things going on, but we've had a pretty impressive response from teachers who've said, this is something we care about and we're going to make it work. And so that is in the works, and that will be made available to anyone. What we need is help getting it to all of the teachers. Because again, I don't have a good way to send everyone an email and say, oh, this is available. And so activate your networks and let them know, or send them to us and I will connect them. Another thing we want to do is create a working group just around youth to try and capture that excitement and figure out ways that we can have them implement the climate action plan. I love the idea of having a way, like a paid internship program, kind of like a climate core, and we're actively looking into how we could build that. Houston is a very large city, and so it's finding the right spot of how many applicants could we have, and what kind of meaningful change could they make given fairly small budgets. So I will also put an ask out if anyone knows of corporate sponsors that would be interested in helping fund summer programs for Houston youth to help learn about climate policy, learn about what we're doing in Houston. It's an incredible opportunity. I mean, I work with some of the biggest energy companies in the world, but I also work with some of the most dedicated local nonprofits and everything in between. And how can we build a program where we can not just provide an incredible educational opportunity, but also like financially support and turn that interest and spirit into seeing some programs implemented.
Thank you. And we have, these are just our last two questions. So the first one is from Mary. She asked, are any energy industry leaders on your committee? And how do they work?
Okay, so I'll start with BP, because after we released the climate action plan, BP announced their global reimagining of what their traditional oil and gas company is going to look like in a carbon neutral world, right? They've committed to being net carbon neutral by 2050 or sooner. And they have a whole team now that's dedicated to helping cities decarbonize. And they approached us and they said, your climate action plan aligns with our new goals. We want to support you technically. We want to support you from a policy perspective, and we want to financially support you. So we work really closely with them, and they are a great entryway to a huge network. We also work very closely with Shell. Baker Hughes was one of the leaders of our climate action plan working group, Centerpoint, NRG, Oxy, Chevron, Apache. I'm thinking of people, I'm probably not going to name all of them. But point being, because we are Houston, we made a really, really big point of trying to work with as many energy companies as we could to let them know what we were doing, to get their input, because they are a big part of our community. We also, though, we will talk with anyone, and we definitely did not exclude anyone. But energy is a big part, but so is every single person, student, child, mother, grandfather, everyone in between has a role to play.
Thank you. And our last question from one of our members says they realize it involves many players outside of Houston, but can you discuss the potential future of high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas and the lowering of related emissions from plane and car travel?
So, I mean, having that as an option could be a big improvement. It's tricky. Trains are hard to build at this point in our city's state's development. That nowhere on the planet are you really seeing a lot of new trains being built. So I don't mean to take away from that one. It could be very, very promising. It could be so cool. Just going to be hard. It's made a lot of progress lately. That's another project. When we talk about a green recovery, we're looking for kind of shovel-ready projects that if they had just a little bit more funding could really take off. That could be a potential because it just makes sense. Like, why have so many people driving back and forth all the time when you could have trains going back and forth? That would probably have incredible impacts in terms of safety, again, in terms of equity, reducing air travel. But you have to think about the community impact, the equity implications, not just here and there, but all of the communities along the way. And that's a really long and involved stakeholder process that has been ongoing for a long time, and it's probably going to have a little ways to go.
Well, thank you so much, Lara, for answering those questions. It has been an honor. The World Affairs Council thanks you so much for sharing with us and our members, our students, and our teachers who have joined us this evening. And again, I hope that you were able to catch Lara's contact information, especially for our educators who have the ability to share this information with their own students. And as she said, this is something you can go online to view as well. And so please feel free to reach out, connect any youth that you may know who want to get involved in sustainability with her office, and she can point you in the right direction. And again, don't forget to join us on Thursday at 5 p.m. as we have a talk with Admiral James Stavridis, and well as our Global Perspective Summit on this Saturday starting at 9 a.m. With many, many different speakers. And we hope that you can join us. For any teachers who join, that is 6 hours of professional development credit for you. And so we thank you again. We hope that you have a wonderful evening and that you enjoy your time. Okay, so thank you and enjoy. Bye-bye.
Thanks.